Welcome to Formosa Dream Chasers.
We're your hosts, Mary Ann
and Ching En.
Please join us as we explore the journeys amazing people take in pursuit of their dreams.
And get insights from their experiences.
Let's hit the road
and get started.
Hello, and welcome to Formosa Dream Chasers. Last week, my friend Michelle Capistrano and I sat down to have a quick chat about our plans for 2026. And so we were talking about what we wanted to happen this year and also how we often have New Year resolutions, which we don't always follow, and what strategies we use to keep ourselves on track the entire year. If you missed that conversation, please do check it out as we compare notes and also redefine perhaps what our intentions are for 2026. And because we started on such a reflective episode, today's program is going to be a continuation of that and will be a little bit more personal. If you've been listening for a while, you probably know bits and pieces of my story, how I ended up in Taiwan, how this place slowly became home, and how the dream I once had has changed shape over time. And today, I want to bring a few of those threads together to make perhaps a more comprehensive and complete picture of my story. So this episode is part reflection, part honesty, and part letter to my past self, back when I first started filling out application forms, collecting documents, and convincing myself that I knew what was best for me and that I had everything figured out. Because the truth is, I didn't. And maybe you don't either. So if you're planning to move abroad for study or work, and you're wondering whether you're doing life right, then this episode is for you. When I first applied to come to Taiwan, my story was very neat and presentable. It had to be. You know, when you start filling out application forms, aside from putting in all of the basic details, the forms don't really ask you how scared you are. They don't ask how unsure you feel about your future or how worried you might be about the decision you've just made. They ask for very clear plans, logical steps, and proof that you belong. So I gave them that version of my story. I talked about my education, about, opportunity, and also potential professional growth, about why Taiwan made sense at that point in my life. And none of that was a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. What I didn't write down was that I was also searching for space to breathe, space to reset after experiences that had drained me emotionally and mentally, and also space to figure out who I was without constant pressure to already have the answers. Coming to Taiwan felt like a fresh chapter, a clean page, a chance for me to become someone new, or at least someone more honest and more authentically me. Someone where I didn't have to bow down to expectations or pressures from other people. I think I've shared before that I originally came to Taiwan to study Mandarin. I grew up in the Philippines in a household that spoke English, Mandarin, and Filipino. But before I came to Taiwan, I have to be honest, my Mandarin was absolutely horrible. Mainly because I didn't really have the environment to practice. And also as a young child, even if my mom, who's Taiwanese, wanted me to spend more time improving my language skills, as a child, you just don't want to. You don't want to spend your precious free time learning a new language. I would rather spend that time hanging out with friends, watching movies, or doing things that, I was interested in or that I thought would be more fun. And so my interest in improving my Mandarin was just frankly not there. I could sort of communicate to my mom in half English and half Mandarin, and that was enough at the time because, as a kid, how much Mandarin do you really need anyways, right? At the most, you would probably tell your parents like, okay, I want to eat something, I want to eat this, I want to go buy that, or can I get my allowance, please? Or you're asking permission to go out with friends. It's not very complicated as a kid. And the very basic phrases already was more than enough for me. But as I grew older, I wanted to connect deeper with my mom, especially. I had such a hard time expressing things to her as my Mandarin skills just wasn't good enough. I couldn't tell her my thoughts. I couldn't tell her the things I felt, and I couldn't really discuss things with her. Since my mom's Taiwanese, and although she migrated to the Philippines, her English and Filipino was also at a very basic level. And imagine at the time, we did not have Google Translate or any kind of translation app. We had to go through the paper dictionaries, right? The Chinese English dictionaries, the English Chinese dictionaries, and just to be able to find words that we wanted to use or explain things. That's how difficult it was at the time to talk to my mom. And I grew up having to often interpret and translate things for her, because she had this language barrier. When I say that, that's not to lessen the difficulties my mom had to go through, as I am more than 100% sure that it wasn't easy for her either living in the Philippines. I'm putting all of this out here just to give an idea and to paint a picture what the environment was for me growing up. And so another reason why I wanted to come to Taiwan at the time was because I felt like I had to discover who I am. Being Asian and growing up in an Asian household, there are a lot of expectations parents have of their children. We hear that a lot in social media. There are so many stories about, Asian kids and what they had to go through growing up under Asian parents. And while I'm sure this is also common for most parents, I feel that culturally, Asian kids just have a heavier burden of having to fulfill and achieve what their parents want from them. And so I wanted that space to learn about myself away from the pressures of having to conform to the idea of what my parents thought who I was, and also to the expectations my parents had of me in terms of what my future should look like. And so at the time, coming to Taiwan, my definition of success meant that I would be staying here to improve my language skills and learning about who I am and, making the most of the time that I had in Taiwan to be myself, essentially, and discover who I am. And, for a while, that was enough. But here's the part that no one really prepares you for. Even when things work out, when you get the clearance, when your visa gets approved, and when you're able to follow your plan, the dream or the idea of what success looks like doesn't always unfold the way you imagined. So in my case, after staying in Taiwan for 2 to 3 years for my language studies, I decided that I wanted to find work and to try to build a career here. I told myself it would be a great experience. It would look wonderful on my resume, and that a lot of positive things will come out of it. Obviously, when I expressed this desire to my mom, she was very unhappy about it because her expectation was I come to Taiwan to study Mandarin and then I go back home to live with her, right? And my desire to work here completely derailed that expectation. And so you can imagine the fallout that happened. And when I decided to start looking for work, the truth was plans that I thought would happen quickly took a lot longer than I assumed. Options for careers weren't always there. And instead of just moving forward to what I wanted the next step to be, it always was a lot of letdowns that I had to deal with. And instead of moving straight, I kind of felt like I was always zigzagging left and right to get to the destination I wanted. And so naturally, my energy ran low, and then my motivation also came and went. And even when I did find work, it wasn't always the job that I wanted or imagined myself doing. However, there was this need, right, to balance practicality with my desires. And the overriding desire was to actually stay in Taiwan at the time. So even if I didn't necessarily find the job I wanted, I had to settle and I had to compromise because the end goal was actually to stay here. Then even when I technically made it, I was able to find work, I was able to stay in Taiwan, and I was able to achieve that as planned. There were still a lot of times, moments when everything just felt as if it was on pause. I remember thinking that, isn't this supposed to feel more exciting, more liberating for some reason, or more of an adventure of fun and, discovery for myself? But the reality looked so different from what I imagined. I had to deal with the daily grind. I had to deal with learning to live by myself. I had to learn to face my loneliness, my fears of being inadequate, and just having to navigate in a country where, again, the language is not my mother tongue. And so even if I did learn Mandarin 2 to 3 years, when you actually live in a country with a different language, there's still a whole new set of vocabulary you need to learn. There is always something new that you did not pick up or that was not taught to you in school. So the thing is, living abroad can really mess with your timeline. You don't really think about all the things you're adjusting to. You have to work within a new system. You have to deal with a new culture. And then you have to navigate in a different society and also talk in a new language while still holding oneself to the same expectations I had back home. And it was easy to forget that we all have support systems from home that is not readily available to us when we move. And so when I had to face that reality, it was very draining and it was just exhausting. There were a lot of times when I felt like my life in Taiwan was on hold, even though I was working nonstop. It felt very much that I was only surviving and trying to get through the day instead of actively learning about myself and figuring out what my next steps were and trying to see what my next goal is. And so that's when I learned something really important that I want to share with everyone. And that is, dreams don't really disappear, but they do go quiet sometimes. Because we have to, although the idea of being able to chase and, pursue one's dream is a noteworthy goal. And I do feel that we should try to live our life along those lines. We have to also balance it with reality, because not everything is going to work out the way we want to immediately. And we have to balance being able to survive, right? Practicality with the, future goal or future dream that we want. And here's the key takeaway that I got from that. Just because our dreams are on pause, and just because we're trying to survive really and just deal with our day-to-day grind, it doesn't mean that our efforts are wasted. It also doesn't mean that you failed. It's just right now you're just on pause. And it especially doesn't mean that you're worthless. Even if when you think about where you are at that certain point in time, it may sometimes feel that way, and it may feel very discouraging. So I went through all of that, when I started to question myself, I started to doubt my decisions. I asked myself numerous times along the way, like, what was the point of going through all of these difficulties? And what was the direction my life was taking? Looking back, I was asking myself, was that all there is to life? Just, surviving. And I wasn't happy with where I was. And I was also honestly struggling quite a lot. Keep in mind, at the time, I was living by myself. I didn't have a support system. I was trying to survive and working at a job I didn't enjoy. Also, being in a country where I wasn't as fluent as compared to now in Mandarin. And so all of these things made it really difficult to thrive, mainly. It was hard enough to try to survive the day-to-day grind. And I found myself trying to just deal with the day that I am going through, just so I can continue to the next day. And at some point, I started questioning myself as to whether the decision to stay in Taiwan was worth it. And if ever you find yourself in that situation, in the same situation where I was, I am going to share with you a letter or some thoughts that I would put down in a letter to the version of myself who went through all of those experiences. Before I read this letter, I just want to pause for a moment. If you've made it this far into this episode, thank you for staying with me all the way through the end. There's a good chance that at least part of my story sounds a little bit like yours. Maybe it's these things that resonated that made you want to stay. So if you are in the same position as I was, where you were full of plans and yet life didn't exactly unfold the way you expected, or maybe you're going through the same things that I was, where your dreams didn't disappear, they just got heavier, quieter, or more complicated, then this letter isn't just for my past self. It's really for anyone who's ever felt like they needed to have everything figured out to justify being where they are. For anyone who feels tired of chasing, but is also afraid to stop. Tune in next week to hear my letter to the version of me who is just beginning her life in Taiwan.
This is Ching and Cho
and Mary Ann Shoko.
See you guys next week. Bye.